we have. And so, some of the biggest favorites of these rules came from critics of it who looked at them and said, there are different approaches that might need to be taken or opportunities to do things better or differently or without having kind of collateral consequences we wanted to avoid. I've learned from past efforts to do these overviews that reading the rules to an audience makes a very boring presentation. So I'm going to try something a little bit different now. I'll explain just very briefly the rulemaking process that led us to the outcome that we have today. Then spend most of my time, maybe about 30, 35 minutes, talking about the significant changes that you want to watch. That isn't a comprehensive list of every change. You wouldn't want that, I don't think, and you can get a more thorough version by watching the presentation of the rule to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules if you want a beginning to end walkthrough. That said, I think I've pulled out the things that are probably most important to most people. Again, not a substitute for reading the rule yourself, but hopefully we've got eyes on the things that most people came to learn about. And then I want to reserve about 20 minutes for discussion. These are sort of meant to be interactive peer networking events. And so we'll try to keep the monologue part of it to about half and not take up too much time so that those of you who have questions can have a talk with us about them. To begin, I can just kind of set the table with what I think are probably the most substantial amendments. These are, again, not all of the amendments, and depending on where you sit, you might find others more important than some of these, but these are the big ones that stick out at a high level. First, we're eliminating pre-qualification from the application process. Those of you who have already applied, which I think is most of you, won't necessarily get the benefit of this process improvement, but it will mean a more streamlined experience for those applying for new applications, including incumbent licensees seeking new applications. Sometimes people are vertically integrating, et cetera, and changing what they're doing. You should encounter a simpler process. Instead of pre-qualification, there's sort of a brief orientation really meant for people unfamiliar with the system. So if you're in the cannabis regulatory space, regulated space already, you have a cannabis establishment, you can go right to the application. You know how to use our computer system. You know how to, what documents we're looking for, et cetera. And importantly, you've been screened for social equity eligibility as well. We couldn't just do away with pre-qualification entirely. We will still have for new applicants who may not be familiar with what's available to them and the nuances of Vermont law, there would still be an orientation, but a simpler application process. Turning to number two, that's sort of how we deliver that result. Instead of a renewal process that looks like just applying again all over every year, we're trying to move to a system where there are certain key governing documents that are set out in board guidance, and I believe that guidance is published now. Just went up within the last few days. So please have a look at the governing documents guidance and try to follow with us in this transition from these kind of hefty annual renewals where all of the same documents would have to be updated to the system of simpler renewal applications where you're likely to be asked for certain core things like proof of insurance, proof that you're using your deposit account, but not nearly as many redundant documents like, you provide to us again the certificate of occupancy that you just showed us 11 months ago or something.
And sorry, I nodded my head prematurely. That one is almost ready to go up. It will be up by early next week. It will be on the website. So we'll put that in the newsletter that new guidance has been published.
Oh, sorry to jump the gun on that.
No
the take-home message is you won't have to guess. As I speak vaguely about what are governing documents, you won't have to guess. There'll be very clear itemized guidance that tells you what each of those documents is. And the idea is everybody would keep theirs current throughout the year. And if changes occurred, you'd update your documents. And that way, when we get to renewal, it really becomes a much more kind of ministerial and simple step of just making the annual payment and verifying that things remain as they were. A lot of people were interested in improving that process both on the user side and on the administration side. So I think that's done now. Again, eliminating early renewal with license amendment is a very similar idea. Early renewal was the unusual term that had been used to describe what happens when you want to change the ownership or location or other salient characteristic of your cannabis establishment. But it was kind of a wonky process, and it moved dates around in terms of when your license would expire. You would kind of start fresh with a new 1-year license, and it threw off a lot of inconveniences for licensees that we just really didn't love. So we've replaced this concept of early renewal with.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off, Gabe. I guess the presentation is working for us, but not anyone else, which is not helpful. Let's try to plug it in one more time. I just changed the permissions. Okay. Let me check with my sources. Sources are saying it is up. So all right, sorry, carry on. We have corrected. The presentation would be helpful because we keep referencing something that no one else could see. Sorry about that.
Okay, so just unplug it, plug it back in.
I had to change I gave the room permission to be able to present.
Oh, that's because we switched.
Yeah.
Probably. Sorry about that. For those of you who were wondering what on earth we were talking about, there is the illustrious intro slide with my name on it, today's date, and what we're here about. Here is a very brief overview. When I was going on about how this should unfold, that's what I'm talking about. And then the first slide was sort of, before I even talk about the APA, I want to just introduce you to these 10 substantial amendments. 1, pre-qualification is gone. 2, we're switching to a system of kind of rolling maintenance of governing documents instead of heavyweight and kind of burdensome renewal processes. That I think really just should be welcomed by everybody. I think everybody wins in that one. In the same vein, early renewal is no longer a thing. When there's a change in license in ownership or location of a license, or a desire to make one of those changes, which requires advanced board approval, you would file to amend your license. The dates would not then change. So that's a big change and a significant simplification of a process that had really been a thorn in a lot of our sides, both on the licensee side and the administration side. There's a as you probably remember, the General Assembly had instructed the board to kind of come back with a retail siting rule. Nobody was very happy with the concentration of retail establishments in certain cities. That was an artifact itself of the opt-in system. Everybody kind of knew that would happen. It did happen, but we wound up with sort of too few controls on locations for retail, and a perception of significant overconcentration in some areas. So the board has not, in this rule update, set out the final retail siting rule. Since in the General Assembly, and the feedback we received from folks in this process is that the rule originally proposed really was not nuanced enough to account for some of the idiosyncrasies of our towns and cities, and that we needed to kind of go back to the drawing board. The General Assembly shared that view and instructed us to consider local input expressly this year. So we're going to go back to the drawing board on that rule and that rule only. But what you see there that I'm talking about in terms of 4, providing the evaluation may weigh retail concentration, is that if there's an application to amend a license to move from location B to location A, the board may assess whether or not that should be granted based in part on whether it relieves or aggravates a situation of problematic retail concentration. 5th, we're setting more nuanced background standards. We had a system that was very tightly tied to what are called listed crimes in Title 13. And these are a list of crimes that the General Assembly felt were particularly serious, but not for cannabis, for other reasons. Some of them had very little relevance to cannabis, and even more important, tying ourselves to those listed crimes had the other effect of requiring the agency to ignore what could be very serious, troubling background events that weren't listed crimes. So we have a more nuanced and fair system, I think, under the new standards that come out in these rules, and it better achieves the result of the purpose of the whole background system, which is to make sure that the people who are in the regulated cannabis marketplace are ready to abide by the law, and are not a threat to the integrity of that system. So I think everybody wins in that one too. We should have a more fair system, a little bit more common sense system with the new standards. Six, the propagation cultivator rules that are familiar propagation cultivators that existed in policy are now codified as part of the administrative rule. Enough said about that. One of the biggest controversies is numbers in the rulemaking process, which was resolved, I think, really constructively, is that we found a way to address licensee responsibility for brands that don't match the cannabis establishment name without doing some collateral damage to businesses that were in that space. We were not really in a way that was problematic in the sense that the board was trying to solve the problem it had, but who would have been adversely affected by the first proposed fix. Really a great story of kind of everybody coming to the table with good ideas and finding a compromise solution that solved the problem without injuring the third parties if that we didn't have to injure. So appreciative of everybody's work on that. So we have this now new compromise solution that is number 7 on this list, addressing licensee responsibility for brands. Another hot topic was consignment and what to do about kind of retail display terms. So what I'm talking about there is it emerged in a couple of cases where we had retail establishments cease operations that many were holding products on consignment and whatnot. And so when their license went away and taking with it the authority to possess commercial quantities of cannabis, we thought we were taking into custody cannabis that was just owned outright by the retailer. And that's how everyone imagined the system to work. And what we found was that there were consignment arrangements in some cases so that the retailers didn't have a possession of the as property of their retail inventory. So there's a fairly nuanced rule that is meant to take care of that, to make sure that what is in the physical custody of a retailer belongs to the retailer for all legal purposes. There's a maximum term for receivable account time that's meant to ensure that something like timely payment, although the board is not a court and will not be enforcing individual cases. But those rules of the road, I think, may smooth things between retailers and suppliers, as well as making it simpler when somebody has to be to dispose of stock, whose it is. So happy to talk about that in greater detail. Another change of relevance to actual operations is that somebody who looks 35 plus can be eyeballed into a cannabis establishment based on how old they look. If I'm old enough, I think if I walked into your cannabis establishment, you would say, well, there's no risk that guy is under 21. He looks like he's older than 35. I can just let him in without interrupting what I'm doing. That does not relieve the establishment of the obligation at the point of purchase to verify with ID before letting me leave with anything. But that was meant to reduce unnecessary burdens on staffing. We were hearing some people were double staffing when they could have had one fewer person on duty. Just because of this doorkeeping obligation. And it's all is the same, though, for people who appear to be under 35. They should be met at the door and carted at the door as well as at the point of transaction. And then the big one is the medical use endorsement. I think that's probably the most substantive thing coming out of this is the implementation of some statutory changes that made this possible last year. And a lot of work internally and with stakeholders has gone into standing up system that's about ready. There is medical use guidance, and that actually is online.
Yes,
I think that one is. That one I'm lose track of what dates the various things actually post. But don't sleep on the medical use guidance. If you have come here to learn about the medical use endorsement, be sure to see that one. There's something wild going on in the room next door to us.
They are literally tearing apart an office next to us. So if you hear screaming, that's what's happening.
I'll start with rule 1. As I said, it's really boring to read to people what's in the rule. We do have the rule text on background. So when this wraps up, I'm going to try to go really fast through these bulleted lists. And that way we can get into the actual text if people have questions about it. But here's what's going on in a big picture, kind of sequentially in rule 1. We've got a new definition for the governing documents that everybody's talking about. There's a new rule that a application left dormant for 90 days can be dismissed. Bureaucracies sort of need ways to clear the clutter. And that is sort of a necessary one that the licensing staff found that they could use. There's clarification about how we calculate canopy in 131. A lot of commenters had asked us not to use the term distinct organism or something that was in that one. We listened. We have a less wonky explanation with the same substantive effect in 131. The new rule creates tier reassignment processes both for tier changes implemented by the licensee because the licensee asked, as well as what in some cases, in some states is called relegation, a compulsory reassignment process where the board can sort of say, use it or lose it. You've been sitting on, tier 4 capacity. You're not using that capacity. We need the ability to make sure that our licenses are matched to actual use. In part because if we have unused reserve capacity, we lose leverage to kind of control or meet market need by controlling total cultivation area because that kind of unused capacity just floats there and could be put into production without or taken out without anybody really understanding it. So Bijou, if you're interested in changing tiers or if you're grossly underusing the tier you're in, have a look at that rule. There's clarification in 1.4.5 that cannabis deposit accounts aren't a decoration. They actually have to be used. The cannabis revenue derived from sales of cannabis is regarded by the federal banking law as drug proceeds. It's really important to protect yourself as well as to protect your bank, which would be not happy to find that it is actually banking cannabis deposits in an account not meant for it. I think we didn't really say out loud, P.S. you must use the account, but you really must use the account now. It should that cannabis deposit account at an institution that knows it's banking cannabis revenues. It protects you, it protects the institution. It's not optional. It also is very important to enforcement in the regulated world. We need to be able to audit where money arrived and went. And that really only works if an establishment is using the designated account to bank its revenues and pay its expenses. So have a look at 145, and if you have one of those kind of pro forma accounts, make it a real one. But put it into daily use. So 149 removes outdated positive impact criteria that were, a long section that made a lot of sense at the beginning of the market that no longer really is necessary. Is stricken. The one a lot of people came for, we set qualifications for medical use endorsement. One of those qualifications, in addition to having appropriate premises and being ready in point of sale equipment, et cetera, and being ready to do the complex things that come with the medical use endorsement, like designating tax-free versus taxed sales, verifying that a patient is who he or she says, with checking their ID again, their patient identification card against their government ID, et cetera. All that good stuff is in 171 and then a corollary in Rule 2. Talked already about the consideration of location or concentration when somebody's trying to relocate. So there's a provision for that in 172. More flexibility to assess background in 1.11, a requirement that we're missing an I in issuance there. Sorry about that. But within 60 days of license issuance, somebody should be operating. The license is not sort of for putting on the shelf. Pre-qualification is replaced with orientation in the way that I was talking about earlier. A change to 1.13.4 kind of trues up how to qualify for social equity designation with legislative intent and make sure that the SE designation is really applied to and benefits people who are new to the market. It's meant to help kind of reduce barriers to entry, not as a way for people who are already established in the marketplace to kind of qualify for certain offerings that are more appropriate to those new to business or new to the cannabis industry. And then we revised the late filing rules in 1.15. This is what happens if you file your renewal late. Some clarity around there turned out to be needed. Um, Again, we're working on more parallel changes to documentation requirements, following that same big idea. Governing documents are going to take over. We're going to have less emphasis on renewal, reproducing documents at a renewal. ID card events, more broader set can be considered. That's probably good for everybody. The temporary employee ID card requirement was removed by the General Assembly at the suggestion of the licensing division. Reason for that is that it was actually slowing things down more than it was speeding them up. When the process started, nobody was sure how long it would take to get cleared. That's happening within a matter of days for employees. And so it no longer makes sense to have that temporary process where you've then got to come back and get the regular card, and people are forgetting to do it. They're getting the temporary card and then it would expire and they have no card. So a much simpler system there that again reflects the maturation of the program and matches what the legislature already did. So you're going to go right into an employee ID card. It should be much simpler for everybody to keep track of and should improve the ability of cannabis establishments to have simple business processes where they track the the validity dates of their employees' cards. And then early renewal, that cursed term is gone, and we're talking about license amendment. And so you'll have at 1.17, which is the same location it used to be. You now have a much simpler rule and clearer rule about how to request board authority to amend your license to change location, change ownership. Moving on to Rule 2, and these rules get simpler as we go into 3 and 4, so it becomes less of a slog. Item changes to match the concept of governing documents. We're now asking that you provide all third-party service contracts. Have a look at the rule for the details of exactly what kind. That doesn't mean that the carpet cleaner needs to be, we need a receipt from providers of that type, but providers of business services that are, contracted services that might ordinarily have been done in-house. We would like to see those contracts or have those available to the inspector. A part of the board's responsibility for enforcing the one license rule at 901 D3. There is no longer escrow in lieu of insurance. That's sort of good news. The reason there was a provision allowing escrow in lieu of insurance is nobody was sure that people would sell insurance as needed. It turns out that they will. And because the escrow in lieu of insurance immediately offers liquidity to the small number of people affected, it shouldn't be a sudden or unexpected requirement that they come up with cash, because this same transition unlocks $5,000 they could pay for years of liability insurance. So everybody wins there. As the policy limits on a true insurance policy, or just orders of magnitude greater than that $5,000, really wasn't protecting you if you had it in the bank. So much better to get insurance for everybody, and we know that we can do it. We know that we have insurance providers in the marketplace offering those policies. So if you're in that group, though, be aware of that. Pets are not allowed in the processing, manufacturing, or storage areas of a cannabis establishment. Notably, Fluffy can still be in the outdoor cultivation area. Doesn't mean your dog can't come on the farm with you. Clarifies that principal training is not required of non-management employees. This is a quirk with Rule 2.2.5. It talked about all agents of an establishment. People looking at that saying, oh, well, an employee is an agent of the establishment. It must apply to them. It's not really the original intent of the board in 225. So 225 is clarifying that the special training for principals and controllers doesn't apply to all your employees. This should be good news. 226 is amended to improve accountability about the use of the inventory tracking system. You can share your credentials, but if you do, you're responsible for what happens with them. So, be careful and thoughtful about when you allow a contractor or someone to use those credentials on your behalf. They're acting as you. There's a standardized transport manifest at 227. That's just meant to improve the consistency of these manifests and what they look like. I think poor law enforcement officers making ordinary traffic stops, just would have no idea if we've got every establishment making its own manifest. So we'll offer a standard one, or we do. A small number of people during rulemaking said, hey, we've already got this baked into our IT systems. We've got a very formal one that says everything we needed to say. We really have to remake that. And we agreed that no, they don't. The rule as written now allows that somebody who has an in-house form that is important to them and well developed can have it approved. They can use that. But for the majority of people who want a manifest form, just use the standard form that's available from the website. 229, happy story in rulemaking. This was the kind of floating brands rule and the effort that we talked about a lot to get a handle on how we would kind of close the regulatory loopholes associated with cannabis brands that don't correspond to a licensed cannabis establishment or the DBA of one. And we got a good compromise there. I think we heard from people that really didn't like the first iteration or would not have been allowed to do what they were doing under the first iteration of the rule. And we got it tuned up now. So have a look at 229. I think that landed in a place that was satisfactory to everybody. Very appreciative of the many people who kind of, patiently, although they were really made nervous by it, brought their ideas to the table and just said, hey, can we do this, in partnership a little bit better? I think we got a good rule, and I'm glad that we improved it the way we did because it doesn't tie the hands of people who were doing, engaged in sound ordinary business and would have had trouble. So that one's a happy story. If you're interested in brands, be sure to have a look at 229. In the less exciting areas, we've got the ASTM standard coloring for the cannabis warning label in 2210. The big push by that organization to make sure that their symbols are consistent across the country and across the globe, in fact. If you have labels printed in the prior color scheme, you will be permitted to spend through them. Now, this shouldn't cause any waste. Just don't order new ones with the old coloring. Please use the ASTM standard coloring going forward when you purchase labels.
Which is on our website.
Yes. The new change to 2.2.17 tells everybody if you have a diversion or theft exceeding $1,000, you've got to report that to law enforcement. I think there's some aversion to reporting, and we had a surprising number of cases where big ticket stuff would go missing. There should be a police report about that. It should be documented, and local police should know they've got, in some cases, a burglary or burglar problem in the area, or they've got some loose cannabis floating around that's been diverted. So they should know. We should have documentation of it. If it's more than $1,000 to theft or diversion, got to make a report, not only to us, but also to local law enforcement. A couple of people in rulemaking said, well, what about manufacturing losses, just to the floor? If I lose $1,000 a shake across a month, do I really have to report? And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about theft or diversion, where something's gone missing and it can't be explained, not where it's ordinary manufacturing waste. A lot of interest in remediation paths from a small number of participants, but I think there was a real desire to see those matured. 2.2.19 is the output of that. It explains what can and can't be remediated, what consumer disclosures have to go with remediated product. A reminder to anybody who wants to add remediation to their offerings, let your compliance officer know, amend your governing documents accordingly. The regulator needs to know you're offering that service, and that service by rule needs to follow SOPs that are approved and as compliant with the rule and as satisfactory. Make sure inventory is tracked, for example. So 2.2.19, if you're involved in remediation at all, talk to your compliance officer, please, and have a look at that rule. There is a subtle amendment to the one license, one span rule that will now recognize as a single premises discontiguous farmland that has historically been used by the same owners as a farm and recognized as a kind of single parcel. Very obscure. It's only going to affect, maybe 2-3 licensees in the entire state. But if you happen to own a historic farm and have been unable to use a field down the road because it is not contiguous to the field that you're in, you may be in luck. So have a look at that rule. 234 is amended to clarify the distinction between cultivators and wholesalers. Years ago, after a kind of confusing start, there was an amendment to allow cultivators to take back their stock from a manufacturer after it had been manufactured, so that they had a little bit more discretion about when to sell, and so that they could store, for example, pre-rolls that were rolled elsewhere. That is all well and good. What can't happen under the new rule, and really never could, this is more clarification than a new rule, is cultivators acting as wholesalers and just brokering cannabis sales for manufactured product that came from cannabis they didn't grow. So how to look at 234, it sets the limits of what a cultivator can take back. In general, the plant is going from cultivator to the rest of the market, not back. But in some cases where the source was the cultivator's own cannabis, they can take back. So have a look at that rule if you're in those shoes. Simplified sample rule in 238. The rule had talked about samples in a redundant way over and over again. Now there are much simpler provisions for cultivators and manufacturers. There's newer requirement that won't affect many people that would require visual shielding of cultivation sites proximate to schools. That means within 500 feet of a school, if your cultivation can be seen from school premises where students are, you should put up some kind of visual barrier. I don't think that'll affect many people. The 500-foot rule is meant to prevent a situation where a hilltop school looks out on cannabis cultivation site 10 miles away. Obviously, that's not necessary or helpful to tell you to shield your thing at that distance. So it's really just if you're right up against the school and the cultivation can be seen. Simplification of environmental reporting, 256, that's no longer part of the renewal process. There are still environmental requirements, but they'll be dealt with separately from license renewal as part of a campaign to make license renewal more simple. Sanitation hygiene requirements for manufacturers are changed at 2.6.1. One of the most significant changes in here, again, of interest to a small number of people, but real impact, is that home kitchens won't be allowed. That means that the equipment on which product is manufactured can't be the same equipment that the resident family uses to prepare meals for their own consumption. So talk with your compliance agent if you're affected by that one. It should be, but in general, nothing too surprising there. Requirement that there be potable water and hot water and whatnot. The other kind of essential elements of cleaning a space are found in 2612. So if you're a manufacturer, have a peek there. Eco-responsible vape devices get a little bit of a nod in 263. That means it has to have a removable battery and meet other product characteristics. So it's a pretty narrow shoot. It does not mean open season for all disposable vapes, but there is a way to have a program, reclamation program, and have more or less economically irresponsible vape devices approved, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Have a look at 263 for that. Again, the sampling rule for manufacturers is simplified at 266. There, we've kind of codified the expectation that that most point of sale systems should have real-time reporting to the state's API. Aware that there are challenges there. So, but as you go forward, selecting point of sale technology, keep that rule 282 in mind, because we're slowly but surely moving toward a system of real-time reporting, and you want to make sure your equipment can do that. It's also a prerequisite for eligibility for the medical use endorsement. So make sure that when shopping for equipment, keep that rule in mind. There's a rule 282 is amended to allow field agents to order that you put a lock on outdoor receptacles if there's a reason to. That started out as a blanket. The original proposal was just to require locks on all outdoor receptacles. A lot of people pointed out meritoriously, where I'm located, that doesn't make any sense. Please don't make me do that. And so now it'll be context specific, but if your compliance agent evaluates your site and says you ought to put a lock on the outdoor receptacle, you do now have to do that. Of course, that will not be done arbitrarily based on who your whims of your compliance agent. Instead, it should depend on the context. Are there passersby? Is there, is there pedestrian traffic past your receptacle? Has there been a problem in the past? That kind of thing. So enough said about that. I already talked about the 282 amendment, where older appearing people no longer have to be checked at the door. Again, the reminder they still have to be checked at the point of sale. That is 100% true of everybody, no matter how old they look. And it's got to be a valid in-date photo identification issued by a government. Those paper IDs that the DMV will give you as a temporary license that say right on them, not useful for any other purpose, are not useful for any other purpose. Don't accept those as identification at the point of sale. You can get a violation for that, and it's unfair to other businesses who kind of want everybody playing on the same, reading the same page, playing by the same rules. However, whatever bad metaphor you prefer, only valid photo identifications. As we get into the world of adult or medical use endorsements, remember that the registration card, the patient registration card, which is a government issued photo ID, can't stand alone as the identification of the person. You've got to be able to point of sale to compare that document issued by this board to identify another identification. So it's not enough that a patient would have just the patient card that's in date with their photo on it. You would have to compare it against another photo ID. That's an important protection against tax avoidance, et cetera, that I think a lot of people are looking at. So keep that one in mind. There is a narrow allowance for drive-through with local approval. I think that had come from a handful of establishments that were maybe set up in buildings that already had drive-through from a prior use or something. Have a look at 2811. That's very unusual because it requires, drive-throughs also are a real hassle in zoning terms. A lot of town ordinances and bylaws will set up a lot of guardrails around them because of their potential to affect traffic and to create an eyesore. So it depends a lot on where you are and whether they bless it. But that rule is there if you're in the small group that may be interested in it. Going up to the one I skipped in 286, point of sale backup procedures. Everybody should have a procedure for how you're going to track sales if the power goes down, if your broadband falls out, and you're not able to real-time report. 2812 is the home of most of the medical use endorsement rules. So if you're having anything to do with that, please have a look at that new rule. 2814 is the kind of end of consignment and the new setup of inventory ownership and payment term limits. So 2814 is the place to look for that. An interesting one in 292 for folks who are either making or testing concentrates. Concentrates that are free of additives now are entitled to a 17% testing variance. It had been 10. And this was something that was important to the board because they were hearing from laboratories and others that the strict 10% variation could sometimes take a completely natural concentrate and result in it being sent back for the addition of dilutants in order to hit a number, which would then be inhaled by the customer. That didn't make any public health sense at all. We all understand why the concentration limits are important to policymakers, but that enforcing at that level when a slight increase in variation tolerance would prevent the addition of dilutants to additive-free concentrates really just made sense to everybody. And this is one where the board really got out there and explained what it was doing to relevant stakeholders so that they kind of understood that this, although people guard the potency caps pretty carefully for good reasons, this was a change that was really in the interest of the public health and safety, as well as the improving the quality of the product that can be available in our concentrate market, which is, I think most people think one of the best in the country. So that should be good news to folks who are interested in that world, and it's good news for the healthiness of our products. There is, as you know, our Rule 2.17, which was originally the emergency rule prohibiting hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids, then became 2.17. It gets a little touch up substantially at the request of liquor regulators and others who are really concerned about the emerging addition of, a milligram per drink to alcoholic drinks, milligram THC, that is. The difference between 4 beers to an experienced drinker and 4 beers, each with 1.25 milligrams of THC, could have very negative consequences for highway safety and personal safety. So those are prohibited now. No hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids may be added to beverage alcohol. And that's it for Rule 2. The 3 and 4 are a lot simpler. 3 is the medical rule, and 4 is the enforcement rule, and they both get much lighter treatment. I'm running over time, so I'm going to go really quickly through them. We define medical product. There are enhanced training requirements for patient-facing staff. You're going to ask me, what are those? We're working on it. We're right in the middle of that right now, but that should be available very soon. Enhanced medical product standards. Those standards are now subject to the same testing, registration requirements that adult use products are. There is more diversity available in those products. Medical products can, in some cases, exceed potency limits, other product restrictions that are applicable to adult use. Their packaging is all going to be black and white. It's going to have to, they'll be very visually distinct. They'll be separated at the retail. For those with adult use endorsement, they'll be physically separated from the other stock. They'll be visually distinct from the other stock. They'll be black and white, with the exception of the colored warning label. The colored warnings called for don't have to be black and white, obviously, but they should really be free of graphic branding, etc. So medical product will really, really look different. And more important, substantively, the testing is going on. That was really perverse that we were not testing a product for some of the most vulnerable consumers while we were testing it at general adult use. That happened in a few states as an artifact of the way these programs developed, but it didn't make sense, and they were glad to be in this new system. And there is an allowance for deregistration and re-verification for good cause. That basically means that if we have reason to question the credibility of the verifications offered by a medical provider, we can go back and ask that the entire tranche of patients registered by that provider get re-verified by a provider that we can be more confident in. That was brought to light by, I think, the indictment of somebody in New Hampshire who was a verifier for a number of our patients. And we realized at that time we didn't really have a tool to deal with that, so we do now. Rule 4, pretty simple. And the last one incorporates express violations for misusing medical use endorsement or for failing to maintain your governing documents as requested or as required. Again, have a look at that governing document guidance when it's available. It explains almost everything you need to know about that, set you up for a smooth renewal. It assigns new severity of adulterant violations based on state of mind. That is to say, you can do something knowingly or you can do something negligently. And if you do it knowingly, it's more serious. Still, you don't have to have known that you were adulterating your product to be culpable for a violation, but it's more serious if you did so intentionally. Obviously, that's kind of a simple, I think most people, that comports with common sense for most people. Now the rule does too. And there's an improved process for health and safety orders. If you get one, there's now at Rule 4.6 a clear path where you can challenge it, or you can challenge its breadth before the board on a really short order. That's to protect your licensees' rights to be heard promptly if something affecting your business and your ability to do business comes up. So we've got that now. And that is the end of the prepared part. So if I'm going to unplug, and I guess we can take questions, talk about any concerns that folks may have.
Yeah, if you want to ask a question, feel free to use the raise hand function to queue up questions. If you're on the phone, people on the phone can unmute themselves by pressing *6. And we'll start with Brooke. Go ahead, Brooke.
Hi, thank you for taking the time today. I was hoping you could clarify the temporary employee ID and the change around that with employee onboarding. The question is, do employees have to wait for that FBI background check before they can start work?
The short one, yes, there's a employee check that takes just a couple of days that they should have before they start work. There is a provision in the new rule that if some unexpected hiccup comes up, although the the temporary ID for everybody is no longer going to be a thing, if there's a particular hiccup in a particular case that causes delay, we can waive the requirement and allow the person to work immediately while they're processed.
Thank you. That helps. So state background check, which comes quickly, is required. The FBI background that takes months is not for start of employment.
That is exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, thank you. That should, in terms of people that are doing a lot of HR and onboarding, that should make your life easier rather than harder, we think, and it definitely prevents the problem of people getting a temp and forgetting to convert it, which we were seeing a lot of. And again, if you run into a situation where you're desperate or the person is being held up by some unforeseen bureaucratic hurdle, the licensing staff can override that and give them permission.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. All right, any other questions? All right, if not, we will call it a day. Thank you all for joining, and this meeting will post a recording on our website if you have any people you work with that you think might want to catch up. So thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, and I can put in a plug for the medical use endorsement guidance. If you look for that and read it. If you have any interest in that endorsement, it should cover all the bases.
Fair to say that was the most anticipated guidance update. So that is out there.
Okay. Great.
All right. Thanks, everyone.